In 2008, workers were digging a trench on a beach on the Estonian island of Saaremaa to bury an electric cable. A few feet down, they hit bone and swords. Work stopped immediately. What was down there wasn't a single grave. It was 2 ships, whole, with the bodies of more than 40 men inside stacked together, their weapons still beside them. Someone, a long time ago, had purposely bent those swords before burying them, an old way of making sure no one could ever use them again, or of discouraging grave robbers from bothering to dig them up. Almost a decade later, when the DNA from those bodies could finally be analysed alongside that of 400 other Viking warriors from across Europe, what they found wasn't just the origin of one attack. It was an uncomfortable question about what being a Viking actually meant, and the answer wasn't blood. Saaremaa is an island in the Baltic, off the coast of Estonia. Around the year 750, it was a common waypoint for those sailing between Scandinavia and points east. The archaeologists who arrived after the 2008 discovery spent 4 years carefully excavating. What they pulled from the sand between 2008 and 2012 had no precedent anywhere in Europe. 2 wooden ships built with the overlapping plank technique typical of Scandinavia. The smaller one held the remains of 7 men, aged 18 to 45. The larger one held 34 more stacked on top of one another, 41 men in total. Their bones showed cut wounds and blade injuries. They didn't die of disease, or hunger, or a shipwreck. They died fighting. Beside them, archaeologists found fragments of more than 40 swords, remains of shields, dozens of arrowheads, 251 gaming pieces carved from whalebone and walrus tusk, and something they didn't expect. The remains of at least 6 dogs and 2 hunting hawks buried alongside their owners. Whoever buried these men didn't just abandon them, they gave them a funeral, with their animals, their games, their weapons. Strontium isotope analysis of the bones and teeth allowed researchers to trace where these men had come from before they died. Most weren't from Estonia. They came from somewhere in central Sweden, likely a very specific area, perhaps a single village or a small number of neighbouring communities. In other words, this wasn't some random band of mercenaries thrown together. These were neighbours, people who had known each other their whole lives, and that made the question of who they actually were far more interesting than it first seemed. Before getting back to what DNA revealed about these particular men, it's worth pausing on something almost everyone believes about Vikings that was never true: the horned helmets. There is not a single archaeological find of a Viking helmet with horns ever used in combat. Not one. The image comes, in large part, from 19th century opera costume design, popularised especially through stage productions of Wagner's operas. And the horns weren't the only invention. For generations, textbooks, documentaries and films presented Vikings as a genetically uniform people. Tall, blonde, light-eyed men, all carved from the same Scandinavian mould. It was a convenient image, easy to draw, easy to sell at the box office. The problem is that, just like with the casts in Pompeii, or the skull once believed for a century to be Cleopatra's sister, that image was never based on real genetic evidence. No one had simply had the means to check it. That changed when a team of 90 researchers, coordinated by geneticist Eske Willerslev of the Universities of Cambridge and Copenhagen, set out to sequence the genomes of 442 skeletons from more than 80 different sites, from Greenland to Italy, from the British Isles to Russia. It was, at the time, the largest genetic study ever conducted on any period of Scandinavian history, and among those samples were the men of Salme. The study, published in Nature in September 2020, reached a conclusion that surprised even the researchers themselves. Vikings were not genetically a homogeneous people. Even before the Viking Age began, the population of Scandinavia was already receiving a steady genetic influence from southern Europe and Asia. It wasn't a closed gene pool, it was a crossroads, much like so many other regions of the continent. That's what Eske Willerslev himself said when presenting the results, and there was more. The genetic analysis revealed that brown hair was more common among the Vikings of the period studied than among present-day Danes. The stereotype of the blonde warrior turned out to be in large part a modern projection, not an accurate portrait of the past. And now, back to Salme. Among the skeletal remains of the 34 men in the larger ship, The genetic analysis found something no archaeologist had been able to know for certain over the previous 12 years. 4 of those men, buried side by side, sword still in hand, were brothers, blood brothers, from the same family. And a 5th man, buried near them, shared enough DNA to likely be an uncle. Someone from the generation before, part of the same extended family. These weren't simply comrades in arms randomly thrown together for an expedition. This was a family that boarded the ship together, and died together on the same beach on the same day 1,270 years ago. Forensic geneticist Mary Allen of Uppsala University, who took part in analysing these specific remains, described it as a poignant detail within a saga written, quite literally, in the genes. 4 brothers, shoulder to shoulder, holding their swords until the end. It's a detail no previous archaeological find had been able to confirm. Only DNA, 12 years after the excavation, could give them that. But perhaps the most important finding of the entire study wasn't found in a single grave. It was found in what happened once Vikings began expanding beyond Scandinavia. As they settled in new lands, in what is now the UK Ireland, the islands of the North Atlantic, their communities mixed with local populations far more than the popular image suggests. And here is the detail that truly changes the question. The team found graves on British and Irish soil of people buried with the complete grave goods of a Viking warrior, weapons, offerings, ritual, whose DNA showed no trace of Scandinavian ancestry whatsoever. They were genetically Scottish, or Irish, without a single drop of Norse blood, and yet someone chose to bury them as Vikings. That's what researchers said when the results were published. Being a Viking for much of that period wasn't something carried in the blood. It was something you joined, almost a trade, a shared way of life, a cultural identity local people could fully adopt, with no one asking to check their family tree. The study also found something that illustrates just how connected that world was. A Viking buried in a cemetery in Denmark shared a second-degree relationship, something like a close cousin or a nephew, with another warrior buried hundreds of miles away in Oxford, England. Entire families scattered across the map of Europe, constantly on the move, trading, raiding, settling, intermixing, and that movement left a trace that's still alive today. It's estimated that up to 6% of the present-day population of the UK still carries Viking-derived DNA. In Sweden, the figure rises to about 10%. 1,200 years later, part of that story is still, quite literally, inside the people walking those same coastlines today. Today, the beach where the 2 Salme ships were found looks completely ordinary. There's no plaque, no striking monument, to tell a passing visitor what happened there 1,270 years ago. But now we know something even the archaeologists who excavated in 2008 couldn't have known for sure. We know 4 of those men were brothers, that an uncle of theirs likely fell beside them, that they almost certainly came from the same corner of Sweden. And we know, thanks to the rest of the study, that many of the men who carried the name Viking across Europe didn't share a single strand of Scandinavian DNA among them. The word Viking still conjures, for most people, a very specific image. Large build, blonde hair, horned helmet, pure Scandinavian blood. We now know that images almost entirely a later invention. What actually bound those men together was, almost never, blood. It was the ship they boarded, the oath they made, the family, by blood or not, they chose to sail with until the very end. Every bloodline tells the truth, but sometimes the truth is that blood wasn't what mattered most.